Okay, let's continue our discussion of commitment problems. So the first type of commitment problem we identified was that a deal would not remain credible if power shifted over time. So if the two sides agree to a deal that reflected the balance of power and they're relatively even, that deal is credible at time t. But if time t plus one, meaning in the future, this power gets stronger than the other one, that initial deal that reflected here can no longer be credible because this power can no longer credibly commit to maintaining it, right? So at that point, the deal would have to be revised, right? The deal would have to change. So let's go on and think about these next possible, let's go on and think about the next possible explanations for war that are based on these ideas of dynamic shifts. So let's pull that up. Okay, so our second commitment problem, the first one reflects changes in power. The second one would look at wars over sources of power, right? So this is a little bit more specific than the first one, but generally argues that power shifts. This is more of a specific example of that. So a second type of preemptive war can occur if the issue in dispute itself is a source of power. So as an empirical example, let's consider the case of the Golan Heights, right? This is a territory that was in dispute between Israel and Syria for quite some time, though Israel has now formally annexed it, right? So the territory is a plateau between Israel and southwest Syria. The territory is only 40 miles from Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, and overlooks a significant portion of northern Israel, which means that northern Israel would be vulnerable if the Syrians were able to control this. So let's look at the situation prior to the Six-Day War. Syria maintained control of the Golan Heights and basically daily was using its position to shell northern Israel, right? Northern Israel is vulnerable given that position that the Syrians had where they could shoot rockets down from that position and attack the Israelis on a daily basis. So long as the Syrians controlled the heights, they had that strategic advantage over Israel, right? So just in terms of military terms, they control the high ground, which gives them a strategic advantage. What the heights also did was allow the Syrians to hide their military maneuvers from the Israeli ground forces. They could send their air force over to patrol that area, make sure that the Israelis didn't get a look behind the heights, and could use the cover of the heights to disguise their military movements, all of which put the Israelis at a strategic disadvantage relative to Syria. Now, by virtue of controlling that Golan Heights position, any deal between Israel and Syria looked unstable because the Israelis could agree to a deal with the Syrians, but they couldn't watch what the Syrians were doing, and the Syrians would have no incentive to tell them, right? So the Syrians, at any moment in time, at any moment that put them at an advantage, or when they gained a temporary advantage, would have incentive to exploit that position and try to attack Israel to further their own bargaining position if they chose, right? So Israel was permanently vulnerable by nature of Syria controlling the heights and by nature of not trusting that the Syrian regime would restrain itself if it gained additional power, right? Once it got that additional power, it would have incentives to use the cover of the heights to mobilize its forces and put it in position to challenge the Israelis again, right? So the Syrians would always be in this position to exploit the Israelis, and at a very blunt level, they could always shell the Israelis at a very low cost and claim that non-state actors did that. So by virtue of controlling the heights, the Israelis were always at a disadvantage. Now, the Six-Day War occurs in 1967. I don't want to go into all the reasons for the Six-Day War, but one of the consequences of this is that the Israelis took control of the Golan Heights. So on June 5th, Israel, as part of its preemptive strike, destroyed 2/3 of Syria's air force. So suddenly the Syrians couldn't protect the Golan Heights from a ground invasion anymore. And 5 days later, the Golan Heights fell under Israeli control. This was a game changer. Now suddenly the Syrians could no longer control or could no longer guise their movements, could no longer since put themselves in a position to strategically surprise Israel. So while the Syrians were able to maintain parity with the Israelis by virtue of controlling that significant position, now that the Israelis controlled it, the Israelis were here and the Syrians were down here. So the Israelis were now in a position to dictate terms to the Syrians, who are in a much better position to resist Syrian demands. This is a game changer, right? The fact that the Israelis occupied the heights changed everything, right? And there's no secret that the Syrians for a long time demanded that the Israelis give back the Golan Heights. And the Israelis' response was always the same. No, right? They had no intention of giving back the Golan Heights and have now formally, effectively annexed it. What this does, just because of the nature of that territory, is it makes any peace deal unstable. Whoever controls the heights shifts power in their favor in fairly considerable ways, and therefore you can't split it, right? You can't give it up. And even if you were to make a proposal to internationalize the Golan Heights so that neither side got the advantage, whoever is currently occupying the Golan Heights, which is Israel in this case, couldn't credibly commit to surrendering it back because you're substantially weakening yourself. So what this does is increase the fact that Israel controlled the Golan Heights, increase their willingness to resist all future peace deals that involve surrendering this territory. So this conflict was a war about territory of strategic value. If the thing you're bargaining over is of strategic value, any deal is going to be unstable because it can't be easily split in a way that a normal peace deal would work. So that's our second commitment problem. There's a third commitment problem, which is that the cost of maintaining peace may become unbearable. Right now, again, the argument is that peace is efficient relative to war. But peace is also expensive, right? It takes resources to build a defense, to build your defense industry. It takes resources to mobilize forces. It takes resources to keep up with your adversary, right? And those resources might become substantial, right? Those resources might become a real drain to your society. And so if that's the case, if you are currently more powerful than your adversary, but the cost of maintaining that advantage is growing, there may be an argument to using your power right now to wipe out your adversary so you don't have to pay those future costs. Right? In the immediate term, that's very costly because you engage in a costly conflict. But once your adversary is out of the way, then you have a peace dividend that can survive into the long haul. That sounds really odd, but that is the argument. And in a sense, that's how you have to think about it, right? It's an argument that's out there. You can judge whether or not it's a reasonable argument or not. Now, let me give you a case where it was actually thought through, and that was in the early stages of the Cold War. So after World War II, the United States was the only country with an atomic bomb, right? It had that nuclear monopoly. That allowed the United States to maintain a presence in Europe with fewer forces where they could always threaten the Soviets with destruction if the Soviets were to threaten any Western European allies. So that maintained the ability of the United States to mobilize only a few amount of its troops, but also have that credible deterrent against the Soviet Union. Now, this changes in 1949, in August of 1949, when the Soviets developed their own atomic bomb. And only a few years later, in 1953, the Soviets developed a hydrogen bomb, which was even more powerful. Now, suddenly, the ability of the United States to deter the Soviet Union with fewer forces in Europe than the Soviets had seems like it's gone, right? Suddenly, the Soviets have caught up in power. They also have a nuclear capability. So it was going to require an enormous effort for the United States to either maintain its nuclear advantage or to mobilize forces to put into Europe to deter the Soviet Union. So in the early stages, right, the goal of the United States, again, was to remain in a position of nuclear dominance over the Soviet Union. But doing that was going to be really costly. That would require a lot of buildup of nuclear weapons or a big military mobilization. So that was a concern, particularly to President Eisenhower, who was a budget hawk, right? Eisenhower did not like to spend a whole lot of money and wanted to actually cut the defense budget. His goal was to bring the budget into balance. So his argument privately was that it might be our duty to future generations to initiate war at the most precipitous moment we could designate, right? What he's arguing here is that the Cold War, a Cold War with the Soviet Union, may eventually bankrupt the United States, right? It might put the United States on a position, on a path that was unsustainable. So right now, right in the 1950s, the United States had an advantage over the Soviet Union in terms of its nuclear arsenal. Why not use it? Why not use it now, pay the cost now? It may happen anyway, and it would be better to happen now when the United States is in a better position than to wait for it to happen in the future. And maintaining this position of dominance over the Soviet Union was going to cost so many resources, it might be worth biting the bullet now. Now, I'm glad that that didn't happen. I'm glad that, in a sense, the cooler heads prevail, and the United States did not decide to initiate preemptive war. But this is the argument for preemptive war. Initiate it now because the costs of peace might become unsustainable in the future. And probably, if you read through enough journals, you've heard something like this, right? This was certainly an argument for going to war with Saddam Hussein, that the cost of maintaining the US position in the Middle East was growing out of control. And so it might be better off just getting rid of Saddam Hussein. I certainly heard that when I was an undergraduate student, right? And so that argument is there. This idea, initiate war while you have the advantage. Don't wait until engaging in a rivalry bankrupts you. So we have three types of preemptive wars. One, we have wars generally in response to the rapidly changing power of an opponent. We have wars in response to issues that themselves are sources of power. And we have war in response to the high cost of maintaining peace. Right, so these issues are all related to dynamic commitment problems that are sources of war in addition to information problems. I think that this explanation in some ways complements the information problem. There may be uncertainty as to whether or not a commitment problem exists, but it certainly does a better job of explaining longer wars and does a better job of why countries initiate war, even though it seems like they have basically complete information. So let's revisit the example of the commitment problem in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, in this case, policymakers in the Cuban Missile Crisis we've established faced information problems, but there's an underlying commitment problem. And that commitment problem was once the Soviet's nuclear arsenal became operational, the US would lose its strategic advantage, right? The US would lose its ability to deter the Soviet Union in Europe, which would be incredibly destabilizing. At that point, the Soviets might try to revise the status quo in Europe, given that they had this capability to strike the United States fairly quickly from Cuba. So once that happened, the Soviets would be unable to commit to upholding the status quo elsewhere, particularly in Berlin, right? At that point, the Soviets might be able to counter what the United States was trying to do in Europe. So time is of the essence here, right? The minute the nuclear missiles became operational, right? The minute they became operational, suddenly everything would change, right? So the policymakers here face this ticking clock. The longer they delayed, the higher the likelihood it would be that the Soviet missiles would become operational. And once that happened, we have a shift in power. And the Soviets would not be able to commit to, since staying deterred in Europe. At that point, once the Soviets' missiles became operational and became abundant, there would be no way that they could commit to maintaining the territorial integrity of Europe or particularly of Berlin. So there was intense military pressure. There was intense pressure to deal with Cuba right away before those missiles became operational. It wasn't because anyone was evil or bloodthirsty or wanted war. It was because if this happened, this would change everything, right? The United States would find itself vulnerable. So rather than face that vulnerability, the United States was being pressured to do something about it immediately and to maintain its strategic advantage. Now, again, it turned out, right, in this meeting that happened well after the fact, where former Secretary of State Bob McNamara met with Fidel Castro, it turned out the missiles were already operational, right? And Castro had recommended their use multiple times, right? Particularly in one episode where a U-2 spy plane was shot down, Castro said that the United States is invading, so you should use nuclear weapons, right? It turns out, however, that those missiles weren't sufficient enough to alter the balance of power because they were tactical nuclear weapons. They weren't strategic nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union did not have strategic nuclear weapons in Cuba yet. And it also turned out that the removal of US missiles in Turkey seemed to make the Soviets believe that they had won something, right? That was important to the Soviet Union. In their argument, having missiles in Turkey was effectively the same thing as them putting missiles in Cuba, right? So both sides got a win-win out of this. But you could see that there was this underlying dynamic commitment problem that things might get out of control, right? And that the Soviets might fundamentally alter the balance of power and that their power relative to the United States might grow too large. And if that happened, all would be lost, right? And so the United States would have this incentive to strike before it lost its entire advantage. Now, let's look at one more case, and that's the case of Iran, right? And before we do that, let me pause, and then we'll talk about Iran more specifically.